Hello and welcome to my next session of my financial option theory track. Today we will be talking about American options. After we have had a few sessions with relevant preparations, mostly around the stochastic differential equations and European options and solving them with Mathematica's AndySolve as a grid method, it's important to talk about the all-important American options, and we're gonna do that today. They are the most frequently traded options type in the United States. Unlike the European options, they allow the holder, that is the buyer, to exercise anytime before the expiration date. The European options allow the holder only to exercise on the expiration, at the point of expiration. So today I will start with an introduction and then show the mathematical definition of the American options. Strictly speaking, we have to say one mathematical definition. There are several available. I'll use the one that is most suitable for our grid method afterwards. I'll then talk about the linear complementarity problem in general. This is the model formulation that I like the most and that is most suitable for the penalty function approach that I use afterwards to actually present a grid method in order to solve these American options. So I will then follow with an introduction on penalty functions and then apply a penalty function to solve the Black-Scholes partial differential equation. It's a way that will allow us to solve the American problem just in the same manner as we have solved it in the European case. We just have to make one change to the differential equation and can use the same grid method. That's a major advantage because we don't have to split the domain into subdomains. Then I will follow with a discussion and compare it to other methods. Then we will look closer at the Greeks, and then I will present a fast third order explicit grid method. I find it particularly useful because it computes us the put option prices for all the stock prices, not just as typically would be done with a tree. We're just getting one particular point, just one option price for one spot value. For another spot, we would have to submit another tree in order to compute a new option price. We have, with grid methods, we are in the great situation that we can compute for multiple input values, in this case the stock price, which is the one that is ticking the fastest. It's the stock price, or later for futures it will be the futures price that's ticking the fastest. Then I will have some final comments and a note on machine code compilation. Alright, so let's jump into it. So I've already mentioned it. The European options can only be exercised at expiration, and the American options give the holder the right to exercise the option at any point in time prior to the expiration. And that conveys the option holder in principle more rights because he has an entire time span during which to exercise his right, and the European option holder only has a point in time, not a time interval, not a time span during which he can exercise his option. So therefore the American option can never be worth less than the European option. It has the same value or it is worth more, but never less. So an American option always has at least the value of the corresponding European option. And that also means, unlike with the European put, the American put can never go below parity K minus S, because if it ever did, then it would be exercised by the holder to get K minus S. Right? You have the right to exercise, it doesn't cost you anything. If the value goes below K minus S and you have the right to collect K minus S through exercise, then why wouldn't you exercise? Right? So this would be an arbitrage opportunity and therefore it doesn't exist, and therefore deep in the money puts have a value of K minus S in the American case, not in the European case. So that means the put price is parity K minus S in the stopping region, and the put price touches on a parity in a smooth manner We cannot have any discontinuities here. And this is called sometimes the smooth pasting condition, or the value matching condition, or the tangency condition, right? We don't have any jump discontinuities here. So let's look at the mathematical definition of the American put. Some things are similar to the European put, some are different. So we have that the value of this derivative at the point t, that's the exercise, that's the expiration time, capital T, and the stock price, is the maximum of 0 and k minus s. And if we take the put option value and we let the stock price go to infinity, the value of the put becomes 0, right? That's a very important thing to recognize here. And this is different from the European case, where at v of at point t, s, we didn't have max of k minus s, but the discounted value of the strike in the deep in the money region. But this means that we get a critical stock price st that is k minus st, k minus the critical stock price when the stock price moves towards st. Okay, so this is the boundary point between the early exercise region and the continuation region, and the derivative is here -1. It has to be -1 to the left of it, where we have k minus s, and the derivative of k minus s with respect to s is of course -1. At this very point we also have -1 when s goes to st, and it is between 0 and -1 to the right of it. Right? This is the European continuation region. For values s larger than st, it's the Black-Scholes differential equation that is satisfied in that area. So the last two equations above show that we get a straight line, parity k minus s, when the stock price is below the critical stock price. And that is sometimes called the early exercise region or the stopping region. And that the contract with the solution from the BSPDE is smooth. That is, we have exactly a smooth pasting of the orange curve onto the blue curve at a critical stock price that at this point we don't know yet and haven't computed yet. You can also see this as a requirement of a smooth delta. We don't want to have a jump in the delta. The first derivative of option price with respect to the underlying price is delta, and this definition of the American put is in line with Merton's first model of 1973. We need a smooth delta, and therefore we have a smooth pasting here of the orange curve onto the blue curve, which means we have a boundary value which at this point is still unknown to us. There is definitely one point to the left of which we have a straight line and to the right of which we don't have a straight line. We have a curve, we have a curvature, a convex function to the right of this yet unknown boundary point. So you remember from the previous session that you would only exercise a call for dividends and a put for interest rate reasons. This already shows you that the dividend-free calls always have the value of the corresponding European calls. The early exercise value is there, but it has a value of 0, right? You have a right, but exercising this right never gives you any advantage. So you have that right, it's undeniably there, you can early exercise, but it doesn't gain you any value. So the value of this extra right is 0, which means dividend-free calls are, well, European options. They are European calls because the early exercise value, even though it's there, has a value of 0. By exercising the option holder forgoes the time value of the option. He only gets parity, and that is max of 0 and k minus s for puts, and max of 0 s minus k for calls. And for European calls without dividends, that's never the case. Why throw away the time value component of the option value? If you don't want to have the option anymore in your portfolio, then it would be better for you to simply sell it, right? It has the time value component. So if you sell it, you get a higher price because the option still contains the time value component of the price. And for European calls with dividends, it may be possible for the option value to be worth less than parity if the calls are sufficiently deep in the money and if a sufficiently large dividend is coming. And right now this is of course questionable. We are in low interest rate times. That also depresses the dividends because a dividend is a interest rate equivalent. No company will pay you high dividends when there are low interest rates. But in principle, it is possible that a dividend is larger than the time value that you forego by early exercise. And that does make it sometimes interesting to exercise American calls early in order to collect the dividends. For these European options, that doesn't help because they cannot be exercised early. European puts can, if they're sufficiently deep in the money, also be worth less than parity, and we looked at this in a previous session. But here as well, they cannot be exercised early because they're European, so it doesn't help. American options, on the other hand, can be exercised early. That's the critical, crucial difference here. And one would typically exercise American calls before expiration to get the stock just before the XD date. That is called the ex-dividend date, sometimes just called XD date. Right? So that's the date at which the stock goes ex-dividend. That's a particular point in time, say 4 o'clock Eastern time, and 1 second later, you are no longer entitled to collect the dividend when you have the stock. That means the stock price immediately is reduced by the amount of the dividend. Right? That's very important to keep track of the exact second that the stock goes ex-dividend, as it's called, XD or ex-dividend. So before that, then you are entitled to collect the dividends. You get the dividend because the owner or the holder, he has now the stock and therefore is entitled to get that dividend. The time value foregone by exercising may be less than the dividend amount obtained. That's important to realize. It's not always sensible to exercise the American call early. American puts, on the other hand, they can be exercised early to exchange the stock for cash, which can then earn interest, whereas the stock would not earn any interest, right? If you have shares, if you have stock, then you don't get any interest for it, right? It's like an asset. It's like a table or a chair or a microwave. You don't get any interest on it, but you would get interest on cash. So here, the interest that you have in exercising a put is to get cash so that you can invest it again and collect interest, which is not something you would get when you just have the stock. So when the American options make it sensible to exercise early, then they must be worth more than the European counterpart because the option holder has additional rights, here the early exercise right, that the European option holder does not have. So in the following, I want to concentrate on the American puts. We leave out the early exercise of calls for dividends because dividend payments come at discrete times. They are really, in terms of modeling their jump diffusion processes, they come at one particular second, that is on the dividend date when the market closes, 4 p.m. Eastern time. And that very second is relevant. That is a discrete point in time, and it would be better modeled with a jump diffusion model and is really only of interest in the last 1 to 2 days before the XD date. Before, the diffusion process means that it's not relevant yet. It needs to be a small time value. If it's a big time value, well then most likely the dividend will be less than the time value which you forego by exercising early. So here it is simpler to just compare the time value of the option with the dividend payment and make an early exercise decision based on that comparison. You do that live in the trading room and you pay very close attention before 4 p.m. Eastern time when that stock goes ex-dividend. And this will not materialize further out than 1 to 2 days before the next dividend's XD date. And it typically is only of interest when the option is close to an expiration, because only then the time value is low. When you have a lot of time value left, it's going to be larger than the dividend. And you get large time value when you still have a lot of time until expiration. That's why it's called time value. It's the value that you still have on the option that is above parity, which increases with the amount of time that is left until you get to expiration. Right? Otherwise, the time value foregone would be too much compared to the dividend amount that you get by having the stock. And especially in times of low interest rate regimes, such as now, dividends are an interest rate equivalent, so no company pays you a lot of it when the interest rate is low. So I've written up a couple of dividend details that I want to skip. Please pause the YouTube video or download the notebook. I'm just gonna skip over this. These are additional complications that you have to keep in mind if you really want to be a dividend hunter, or if you want to make an early exercise. There are dividend concerns that I've written down here. There are additional concerns. There can be taxation concerns. The dividends get taxed different compared to other income in some countries. For example, in Germany, there can be tax credits for dividends. Again, such as in Germany, they're called Steuergutschriften. And many retail brokers don't even pay you interest on cash balances. You get no interest. It's an interest-free account, or you only get interest from a certain minimum balance onwards. So all the considerations that we have here, and that I will be assuming for the theory in the following, don't even apply, because if you don't get interest on your cash balance, then why would you want to exercise early? And most retail brokers also charge the customers an early exercise fee. So that further diminishes the difference between a dividend and the time value that you forgo, right? You need to really see if the time value that you forgo minus the dividend amount minus the early exercise fee that your broker charges you plus tax effect is still larger than zero, right? So I will skip over all these details here. Please pause the video or download the file. So in the following, I'll focus only on the early exercise of American puts, because this question is not based on an unpredictable jump diffusion model, effectively requiring the trader to make that decision just before the dividend goes X. That's a very important tactical operative decision, how you handle the early exercise of American calls. So we only focus on the puts here. When there is sufficient motivation to obtain interest income, but note again the last two items in the box above, then American put should be exercised when its value is parity, K minus S. Again, ignoring the dividend matters here. A retail brokerage customer usually has to pay fees, and that definitely makes it more complicated and is generally making it incomparable to the market maker who doesn't have to pay any of these fees. The times of low interest, I had already mentioned that. And for option pricing theory, we assume that we have a friction-free system. All these things with fees don't apply, right? And I realized that this is not the case for the retail investor and is more in line with the situation of the market maker. All right, so now let's get a little bit into the theory. I want to present the formulation of the American option as a linear complementarity problem. To solve a state space PDE system like the Black-Scholes PDE system, the PDE and three conditions are needed. We are in two dimensions, so we have four conditions. We have two conditions in space and one in time, and that makes it a Dirichlet problem. There are others, for example, with derivative conditions, and that would make it a von Neumann problem. But we're not doing this here. We solve the traditional Black-Scholes PDE with Dirichlet conditions. So that leads to an open boundary value problem, or a free boundary problem, or a moving boundary value problem. All these terms are used, they really mean the same thing, because they point between the normal price process region and the intrinsic value region, also called the European region versus American region, or not an exercise region versus early exercise region, that is not known, right? That is this smooth pasting point here that we have. We don't know yet where this point is. We could solve it iteratively. We don't know it, and we are seeking a way to handle this grid method actually without having to compute it. Why would we have to deal with it when we don't really have to? And it's really a boundary as a curve. It's one point in this two-dimensional display, but it's really a curve, and it changes with several parameters. So we don't really want to deal with it. We would prefer a method where we don't have to handle it, but we would kind of need to know it in order to change the pricing method between European pricing and American pricing. So the boundary of the PDE process is open or free or moving. It's unknown, and that's where the name open boundary value problem comes from. And here are two links to Wikipedia pages about the boundary problems. So you remember from the previous session that the European Black-Scholes PDE is BS-PDE equals 0. We are setting it to 0. We have to do it. We have to set it to 0 because we have to assume that there are no arbitrage possibilities in our hedge portfolio. We cannot make money or lose money. So we are saying the Black-Scholes PDE is equal to 0. That is important to realize. With the American put option, we now have a different situation. In the continuation region, the American option behaves like a European option. I think that's easy to understand. So far, so good, because we are not in exercise. We are simply behaving European manner. We don't want to exercise our options early, so we are behaving European. But in the stopping region or in exercise region, the put does not behave like a European put. Instead, its value is k minus s, right? We want to exercise early in order to get k minus s. The option can only be in one of these two regions, not in both. So our formulation of the model is now in this manner. We have the European part, that is the Black-Scholes PDE as we had it before, and we now multiply it with the difference of the option price minus k minus s, the option minus parity. And this is one of these two factors. Notice that this is a product of two differences, right? The right part is v minus parity. That's one of the two factors, and that's why it's called a linear complementarity problem. We are setting it to 0. So in order to enforce this, in order to have a product of two differences be equal to 0, it must be the case that one of the two factors is 0. We cannot have both factors be non-zero, because then their product would no longer be 0. Right? The product, we use a product that we set to 0 to enforce the fact that the two alternatives are mutually exclusive. That way, one of the two factors is forced to 0, and it's impossible that both factors are different from 0, because then the product would no longer be 0. Therefore, exactly one of them has to be 0. Both of them 0 is impossible, because the option is either in one subdomain or in the other. It can't be in two disjoint subdomains at the same time, right? That's what we enforce by setting a product to 0. And this is where the term complementarity problem comes from. These two solutions complement each other in the sense that when one is different from 0, the other must be 0, and vice versa. That means either the Black-Scholes PDE is valid, that's the European case, the continuation region, or we have the case that v equals k minus s. That's the American case, the stopping region, the early exercise region. It's impossible that both are valid. All right, so here's a Wikipedia link about the linear complementarity problem. All of this is really nothing new. The linear complementarity problems have been used in mathematics for centuries. It is absolutely nothing new conceptually. And we'll now solve the American put problem as the linear complementarity problem by using a penalty function. And I need to prepare this a little bit. We first need a simple introduction to penalty functions. So the penalty methods also are nothing new. They have also been used for centuries, including on applications in PDE solution methods. They are regularly used in many areas of applied mathematics. For example, in the interior point methods of linear programming, they are based on convergence with penalty methods. So let's assume we have a very simple ODE system. We just want to have u prime equals minus u, and our initial condition is u of 0 is 2. Okay, that is a very simple solution. We can easily integrate that by hand, but we also have the additional constraint that we want the solution to be never below 1. Right, u of t is larger or equal 1. So in this simple case, we can still compute the analytical solution. We split up the domain. We have a split point of the natural log of 2. To the left of it, the solution is simple 2 times e to the minus t. That comes directly from this super simple system that we have. And to the right, it's the constant number 1. It has to be, that was our constraint. We have imposed this additional constraint. So we get a piecewise function in this very simple case, but only in this very simple case. So plotting it, we can see visually that we have 2 times e to the minus t on the left side below the natural log of 2. That is this part here with that curvature, and to the right it's the constant number 1. That's the blue curve here, our piecewise function. I think fairly straightforward to understand for this simple example. We need to back out where that kink is at the natural log of 2, which for more involved differential equations would be impossible to do, right? It's only so simple because of our differential equation system here that is so simple. But if we didn't have this open, free or moving border, then things would be fairly normal. It would be easy and smooth. We can easily see that at the vector field. We can see we start at u of 0 is 2, and from there it's 2 times e to the minus t, right? We're getting a very smooth and easy to understand vector field. But this is if we didn't have this restriction and this moving border at the natural log of 2. We do have this restriction that the solution cannot go below 1. So to the right, we do have a different situation. And it means we have to reconcile this with the vector field that we have to the right of the natural log of 2, which would be 0, right? Very simple and straightforward. To the right we have 0 here, right? See this point. And we need to reconcile these two at this breakage point. Otherwise we don't really solve this new differential equation with that additional restriction. So this won't be an easy, straightforward task, and we won't be able to do this without a breakage in the continuous flow. It's impossible because we have two tasks that are really conflicting. So next requirement, we want to solve this initial value problem numerically because our real-life problem will be much harder. And if we used a traditional grid method, we'd have to check in every time step if the constraint is satisfied. That's kind of problematic, right? Instead of computing u of n plus 1 directly from u sub n, we always have to check for the maximum of 1 minus this delta t times u sub n and 1. We need to take the maximum value of these two for our n. And this is done in many grid methods. This is how it is done in many American option pricing grid methods. This would correspond to a Brennan-Schwarz type of algorithm for pricing American put options. But we're using Mathematica and we have NDSolve and therefore don't have to implement the grid method on our own. We use the method of lines that we have implemented in NDSolve and we go our merry way with NDSolve. We don't have to worry about implementing such a grid method. So next, we also would like to simply solve the DE that automatically fulfills this extra requirement. We do not want to have to split the domain into subdomains and then introduce the piecewise function as we've had above. Right? So we can do this with a penalty term. We get an equation that approximates this fairly well by simply adding an extra term to the equation. So we now introduce a penalty term instead of the original problem. We now consider the problem where we have also v prime equals minus v as we had before, but we're adding epsilon divided by v plus epsilon minus 1. And as typical in calculus, epsilon is a very small positive number, right? So epsilon is larger than 0, but significantly less than 1. And we keep the initial value, v of 0 is 2. Right, so you will notice it's the same as we had before. Right, we had u prime equals minus u, but we now are adding this penalty term that consists of epsilon divided by v plus epsilon minus 1, with epsilon being a very small positive number. So this is now our penalty term that we're adding to this differential equation. Initially, v is 2, so the penalty term is of order epsilon. Right, so we have a tiny number here, and we're dividing it by something much larger. So for all practical purposes, this penalty term is 0. And when we're adding this to our differential equation, it doesn't make a difference. So this is behaving like our differential equation that we had above. It means we didn't really alter the differential equation. For all practical purposes, the penalty term epsilon is 0. But the effect of epsilon increases as v approaches the asymptotic solution given by v bar equals 1. And I'm now using v bar to indicate the value of the open or moving or free boundary value. In general, we don't know it, so I just give it a variable name. I call it v bar. And now our system solves this system of 3 equations. Our solution v of t is between v bar and 2. Right? It has to be less than 2 because that's where we started. Right? Our v of 0 was 2, so that's where we start. So that's the maximum that we have. You see that the red arrows are never above 2. And the lower limit has to be v bar. There's no choice for v to be outside of these two bounds that we have for t larger than 0. Yes, we're integrating to the right. We're not going negative in time. We also see that the curve has a negative first derivative. It's going down, right? We can see that it's monotonically decreasing. So v prime of t is less than 0, and the second derivative is larger than 0. That's not all that important at this point. But that means our solution v is valid between v bar and 2, with v bar in general still an unknown value of t, which is our open or moving boundary at this time. So we'd have to be able to handle v bar and its location t, because it is a spatial constraint limit of integration in our initial value problem. So we are still not done yet. We still have to solve it. But we can see already that we don't really have to split the domain. It would be ideal if we could treat it as splitting it without actually having to split it. So in the next step, let's generalize this. And instead of 1, let's use a general parameter p larger than 0. So you see that here I'm replacing the 1 with a p. Here at the, you see we had a minus 1 here. This is the only change, right? Instead of minus 1, I'm subtracting p, and p has to be larger than 0. That's the only change I made. I just replaced the 1 with a p. Nothing else is what I'm changing here. And now let's look at a pair of solution curves that now depend on p. And we're using epsilon values that get progressively smaller all the way down to 1 over a million. So we do it with this manipulate. And you can see that as we change p, we are getting different levels of p to the right of our moving boundary value problem. And to the left, it is the function that we had before. It's the green curve 2 times e to the minus t. Right? You see the green curve here is going right through the moving boundary. It is the function that we want to have on the left side. And we are approximating our solution better and better as we made our epsilon smaller. That's why we call it epsilon. It's supposed to be a small value just barely above 0. And we can see that for larger numbers of epsilon, we really don't get a good approximation, not on the left side, not on the right side. Right? You can see that here for blue, orange, green, red, we're getting solutions that really are not good approximations. But for really small numbers, we do. If we take the lila curve here, we're getting lila is the same as green on the left side, and lila is our constant value p on the right. So here in this case, it's p is a half, we can change this number to whatever we want. And we see that we always have lila equals green on the left, and it's always our value p on the right, provided we use a small epsilon. It's pretty bad for larger values of epsilon, but we're getting pretty good results when we use small epsilon. Okay, so note that the lila curve corresponding to epsilon equals 1 over a million is de facto constant to the right of the free boundary, and it has the value of p. To the right, that is, right? To the left, it's still 2 times e to the minus t as we had before, right? It was the green curve to the left. So we clearly see that the approximation is getting better the smaller we make our epsilon. And for larger values of epsilon, the curves are still too far from both, right? From 2 times e to the minus t and 1, the left side and the right side, right? So we are really not getting good results for large epsilon. Before I continue, I want to make clear why we get a constant p for large values of t. Because in general, we have v prime of t equals a minus v of t as the differential equation with an initial value. And as a solution, we get a. And the important thing here is it's a constant number. This was our constant number on the right side of the equation. So the left side, you can maybe see this better if we rearrange it. We are saying that the derivative by t plus the function itself equals a constant. If we do this, then there's only one solution for our function. Our function can only be that very constant. In other words, if a function plus its derivative is constant, then that function is that constant, right? The state plus the change in state is constant means that the state is constant, right? You can't have a variable state and a variable change in state added together and that's a constant without having that function itself being constant, and not just being constant but being that constant a. Right? This is pretty trivial to see from this differential equation here. So now our corresponding stream plot, let's look at that, and we see that we clearly have those two regions. We have a moving boundary which we never computed. We know, of course, it's the natural log of 2 in our simple example, but we never had to explicitly compute it for our differential equation of our stream plot. We have the behavior 2 times e to the minus t on the left, and we have the constant vector plot of 0 on the right. And we see that this quality of this approximation clearly depends on epsilon, and epsilon here is computed as 10 to the minus exponent, and for, I'm changing the exponent here, for a large exponent like 1 we get a pretty bad solution. You see on the right it's not even a constant here for smaller numbers, and we see that the function value is too high to the left of it, but as we increase the exponent then we are decreasing epsilon, and we see that for our epsilon 10 to the minus 6, so 1 over a million, we get a very good solution. We get a really good fit on the left side, that is 2 times e to the minus t, and we have a constant 0, a constant 1, change 0 on the right. Okay, so our quality depends on a small value for epsilon. Okay, so if we wanted to solve this explicitly, then we'd be chewing granite. If we want to use an explicit solver like dsolve, we can still do it for an epsilon of 1/3, which again, we want to get numbers as low as 10 to the minus 6, all right? For 1 over 3, we can still get an explicit solution, but it looks pretty terrible, I would say. For all practical purposes, I would call this a rather complex function, and our differential equation is not so much different. It's our v prime equals minus v as we had before, plus the penalty term, where epsilon is just 1/3. And even that relatively simple differential equation has a very complicated solution, as we can see here by using dsolve. We can make epsilon a little bit smaller. For 1/10, I can still use the relatively new function asymptotic dsolve value, and I'm getting a function here that basically is our constant 1. We can see that here. So let's plot them together, and we can see that for epsilon 1/3 we get a bad solution in orange. For epsilon 1/10 we get a solution that is pretty decent for larger values of t, right? We're getting the constant here. The constant value of 1 is of course wrong on the left side. It's okay for the right side, but nothing really is approximating our blue curve on the left side. So we're doing pretty bad when we use numbers like 1/3 and 1/10. We really have to get to a small epsilon like 1/1,000,000 up here. Okay, so we can see that we were able to enforce the constraint simply by adding a penalty term to the differential equation. That's the important thing here. We never enforced the constraint explicitly. That means that we can continue to use our grid solver, and we never had to split the domain into subdomains or introduce piecewise functions. Okay, and with these preparations, we are now ready to apply this concept to the linear complementarity problem developed above and use a penalty term to simply switch between the European and the American subdomains. These are the continuation region and the stopping region. So let's apply the penalty function approach to our Black-Scholes options pricing. We'll now do the same thing with our Black-Scholes PDE. We're adding a penalty term. So let's remember what we had for the Black-Scholes PDE. This was our European Black-Scholes PDE. And all we're doing now is that we're adding a penalty term. It looks similar to the penalty term that we've used in our simple ODE above. So if you look closely, there are two differences. Instead of p, we are subtracting k minus s. Right? This was our p above. We had v minus p plus epsilon in the denominator. So here we are replacing p with k minus s. This is parity, right? Note that k minus s was parity. And the other change that we have is that we're also multiplying this with capital L. In the simple ODE example, we just had e in the numerator. Now we are multiplying e with capital L, which is a proxy for a large number, for infinity. That's why I called it capital L. So we are getting the same Black-Scholes differential equation that we had above. Look at the orange box here, except that we're now adding this penalty term. Here in this orange box, we also have this penalty term, and we're still setting it equal to 0. Our PDE is still set equal to 0. So note that in contrast to the simple example above, we also multiply the penalty term with a large number L, so that in the limit epsilon to 0, we don't get k minus s, but we're getting L, our proxy for infinity. Right? It's clear how we are seeing how this develops. If our put price V has the same value as parity, k minus s, this difference is 0. When this is 0, the epsilons cancel out, we're getting L. So when then the put price is the same as parity, we get capital L from the penalty term, a large value. And if they don't, if the put option price is not the same as parity, then we're getting small epsilon, because what the denominator does doesn't really matter, but epsilon is our multiplier. We multiply this down to 0. I want to emphasize that the new PDE with the penalty term is no longer linear. Right? The Black-Scholes PDE here, this orange box is a linear problem, but the penalty term makes it a nonlinear problem now. So the Black-Scholes PDE was of the type linear backwards parabolic, and the penalty term destroys the linearity. It is still backwards parabolic, but it's no longer linear. But a PDE solver doesn't require a PDE to be linear. The method of lines that we have in AnySolve works on nonlinear problems as well, and Mathematica's AnySolve handles the method of lines very well. I've been using it for, I think, at least 15 years, and it has always been great and has only ever been improved. So once we add the penalty term to the European Black-Scholes PDE, we can now treat the new PDE the same way as we did before. That's important to realize. We miraculously include the American case in it. And if the penalty term is chosen in the right manner, and I've shown this up here, we'll basically get 0 in the European case, well, epsilon, but with a small epsilon, like 1 over a billion. This is our proxy for 0. Then we have PDE equals 0. That's already the case for the PDE in the European case, right? Because that's what we have here. The PDE is equal to 0, and we're getting the European PDE through the American PDE by having our epsilon very small here, right? So in that case, we have PDE plus penalty term is 0, must mean penalty term itself is 0. And again, we're doing that by setting epsilon to 0 or near 0. Otherwise, it would no longer be the European PDE. In the American case, however, the penalty term needs to go to minus infinity. And in that case, the American condition is enforced, because the only way that can happen if the penalty term is L, and that was our proxy for infinity. So the way we get that is, as I've briefly shown above, if the put price is the same as K minus S, that was early exercise region, then this is 0, epsilon cancel out, and we have a large L here. So if that is supposed to be 0 when we're adding it to the European penalty term, that means L goes to infinity, and the rest of the European dynamics, the rest of the Black-Scholes PDE is getting crushed to minus infinity. So that means the difference is 0, the epsilon cancel out, and only L remains, right? Infinity. And I think this is a remarkable result, because it allowed us to use the Black-Scholes PDE in the American case simply by adding a penalty term and using the same grid solver. So I also want to point out this works in both directions. If V is K minus S, then the penalty term is L. I've explained this a few times now here. V minus parity is 0, epsilon cancels, we get L. But conversely, if the solution process makes the penalty term L, right? And that's what we're ultimately interested in. We're interested in using a solver in order to get our option price V. We're really after V here. Then this can only happen if the process cancels the epsilons out, which forces the process to make V to be the same as K minus S, because otherwise V minus parity would no longer be 0. Right? So this works in both directions. Okay. And the unknown boundary now is exactly the point where the European region touches the American regions. It is the split of our subdomain. And this means that's where our pricing method would have to change. So by adding the penalty term to the European PDE, then the solver effectively switches without ever having computed the outbound boundary explicitly. I think that's a remarkable result and very, very practical. So let's define some numbers. We set epsilon to be 1 over a billion, and we set L to be 10 million. So the actual numbers epsilon and L are not very important for this. It only needs to be ensured that their product is sufficiently small, because in the European case we want it to be 0. So 10 to the minus 9 plus times 10 to the 7 is 10 to the minus 2. That's our proxy for 0. But L alone has to be big, and we use 10 to the power of 10 to the 7th, which is our proxy for infinity. And I emphasize that more research could definitely be done here on optimizing epsilon and L and their interplay when solving this differential equation. We don't need more refined values for epsilon and L here for our approach, but in general this would have to be done, because it's not necessarily the case that stock prices have reasonable prices, and I'm leaving reasonable undefined here intentionally. We assume that we have reasonable stock prices and strikes for this method. So for example, if you take the Berkshire Hathaway stock that is almost $300,000 for one share, then this would definitely require a resetting of L and epsilon. You definitely would have to recalibrate this problem. But most stocks are not $300,000 for one share. So I definitely have to point out for large stock and very large stock and strike prices, these two constants mean that the problem is not scalable. Okay, closing this footnote, I have to say there you have it, right? By adding a certain well-crafted penalty term to the European Black-Scholes PDE, you can price American using the same solver or grid method that was used previously to price the European options. And as before, we use Mathematica's AndySolve for that. It uses the method of lines internally, and I think we are ready to go with this. I do have to make a couple of comparisons. I have to make a couple of explanations before we are ready to do the actual computations. I think it's important for the computations that we are about to make that we understand some of these points that I have to make in the following discussion. I think it's important to understand it ahead of time rather than afterwards, otherwise we don't really quite understand why they work when we do the calculations and why this is a superior method. So I think I need to make these explanations beforehand. First, I want to make a comparison to the traditional tree methods that are very beloved and used by many practitioners. Unlike most option pricing approaches used by practitioners, which compute only one option at a time, which causes the method to be submitted for computation again and again and again, the penalty method that we are presenting here gives us a whole option surface. Right? It's not just submit for one price, submit, compute, receive, ask question, get answer for just one option price. And in general, that is the case with grid methods. Right? We generally like to use grid methods in order to get entire vectors of answers. So we don't want to submit something just to get one option price. And with a tree method, we do. A tree method gets you just one option price for one stock price. And if you want to know it for a different stock price, and even if the price of the stock just changed by 1 cent, then we have to submit the whole tree again and wait for it to finish. Right? That's why we like grid methods, and with Mathematica's AndySolve we are able to get an interpolation object that gives us entire option surfaces. It could be more than surfaces in higher dimensions. We're calling it surface because we're in 2 dimensions, but we could in principle get entire option volumes if we use 3 or higher dimensions. And we've already done that before. We already did that in previous sessions when we computed entire option surfaces for European options. And a smart approach will always store its computed results in memory and not just produce one number and then again and again and again. The output is an array of values, and it is an array of option prices for every space-time coordinate. And now when we use that approach, all that is needed is to look up the option price in memory. We have already computed it, and instead of recomputing it, we just read it from memory. And we have a discrete grid, so it's necessary to interpolate in these cases, because usually what we are requesting will not be a node point. So we have to interpolate to get infinitely many solutions between all the node points. But then we can use a simple interpolation using the neighbors. And this is where Mathematica shines again, because the return of AndySolve is already an interpolation object, and it is third order by default, which is also ideal for smoothness. The default is third order, which is exactly what we want. You basically get cubic splines, and I don't have time to talk about all the advantages of cubic splines, but if you can get third order or cubic splines here, that is absolutely ideal. So here you can read off the values directly from the interpolation object. No need for you to implement any interpolation function. Mathematica has that already. So the next point that I want to make in this discussion is about the Greeks. So the standard Greeks come from that method for free. The information for delta, gamma, and theta, they're sometimes called the standard Greeks because they're based off the 2 variables, space and time. They're contained in the grid structure itself, and the PDE solver just gives us that as part of the return. So as every node in the grid has neighbors, there are exceptions at the boundary, and I'll talk about this in a moment. The neighbors are always interior points here for the sake of this discussion. It's trivial to compute any derivative in terms of space and time, and these are delta, gamma, and theta. So for vega and rho, that is not the case, but they're not variables, they're parameters. So for them, it's necessary to submit again in order to get a new interpolation back, because rate and volatility are shape-defining inputs, they're parameters, but price and time to expiration are not. So if you compare that with a traditional tree method, it's necessary to submit a new tree computation for every Greek, and multiple times so, including for the standard Greeks. Because for a tree method, there's no difference between variable and parameter, right? So you need it for delta, gamma, theta, vega, and rho. It's all the same. And it's necessary to submit at least two trees to get just one derivative value. If you use the simplest linear approximation, that would be the secant method, and then the derivative approximation is simply f of x plus h minus f of x minus h divided over 2h. You will still remember this from 10th grade in high school. This is the secant method, and it requires two computations of our option prices. We need f at x plus h, and we need f at x minus h. So we need to submit at least two trees, and that's just for the simple secant method. So it becomes necessary to submit two trimes, one for f of x plus h and one for f x minus h, and that is just for the simple secant rule, which is the simplest and least exact approximation. It's first order, and for second order approximation you would need three f terms, right? We're not even talking about that. We're talking about the simple secant method, and we need to compute 2 times f. For higher order approximations, more f terms would be required, so the running time would even grow even further. And this provides only one Greek, just one, and we need so many of them. Thus, to get delta, gamma, theta, rho, and vega, it's now necessary to submit 10 trees, and just for one combination of inputs, in particular for just one stock price, but that's the one that ticks very fast. It's always the stock price or the futures price that ticks the fastest in the markets. So next, trees are very expensive. If the 5 Greeks are needed for another price time pair, then 10 trees have to be resubmitted again and again and again and again, because we don't just want to have it for one pair. We probably want it for several stock prices, and we wanted to have it for several T's, because we probably have multiple expirations in our portfolio, not just one. So the problem just keeps compounding and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, simply because we do these pointwise calculations and we don't get back an entire vector of solutions. And next, if a second order approximation isn't needed, then we need to submit 15 trees, and I mean, it's just progressively getting worse and worse and worse. And then we should, if you go this way, you definitely should cache it, pre-populate in memory. In Mathematica we call that memorization. If you do this on the fly, then you're just getting progressively slower and slower, slower. When you do this in live trading, just getting slow, slow, slow. But the interpolation object from the solver resides already in memory, so trading application can simply read off the values when needed. Yep. When you need it, it's already computed. Just read it from memory. You should never trigger the computation by the time you need it. Then you're introducing latency, and you can never do any sensible algorithmic trading with that. By the time the option price or Greek is needed, it's already computed, waiting to be read off from memory. Any professional uses grid methods. So the next point that I want to make with this general solver is the time dependence. The Black-Scholes PDE makes no stipulations as to the complexity of the terms SKT, rho, sigma. They are all at least time dependent, and some of them are also two-dimensional, depending on stock price. Usually pricing methods assume volatility and rate are constant numbers, and this is hardly realistic. As we all know, rates are at least time dependent. They're called rate curve or yield curve, and volatility usually exhibits a smile or a skew or other pattern. They're usually called smiles or skews. Those are the two most frequent ones. Sometimes you get the opposite of a smile, you get a frown, but that is rare and usually indicates mispricing. The Black-Scholes PDE works for these non-constant function-based expressions for rate and volatility as well. We've seen that in the last session, where we've used time-dependent and space-dependent parameters. And the AndySolve setup that we're using here is merely a description of the process. We are basically defining it, we're configuring it. It's very descriptive, right? It goes in line with descriptive programming. The PDE itself doesn't require any term to be constant, and the solvers people implement usually do, because they can't handle non-constant or function-based expressions for volatility or interest rates. But the PDE itself was derived with arbitrary SKT, rho, and sigma. The PDE itself doesn't care. The PDE itself doesn't stipulate that these are constants. We have to be able to solve them in 2 dimensions, space and time. So the method of lines works always very well and allows us to use functions for them as well. They don't have to be constants. That's another big advantage that we have here, and we've already looked at the time and space dependent in the European case in previous sessions, and we can retain this behavior, this flexibility in our American pricing, because we really didn't change anything other than adding a smart penalty term. The next item I want to talk about in this discussion is the precision. So AndySolve accepts a user-defined grid as input, and that is great news. Given that a plain vanilla option payout profile has a kink at the strike price, that is the point where the function is not differentiable, a solver will produce a more precise solution if the grid is made denser around the strike. The Black-Scholes PDE is quite well behaved if the grid is coarser when we are further out in the wings. But at the kink, at the strike, we really don't want to have a coarse grid, we want to have a dense grid. If we can use a coarser method further out, and it's called in the wings by the traders, it also speeds up the method a bit, because AndySolve doesn't overshoot or has trouble with the step sizing mechanisms in that case. That's an implementation specific detail for AndySolve, but still we have to make sure we are really dense at the strike, but we can be very coarse in the wings so that we somewhat make up for the time that we lose by having a dense grid at the strike. So where a function in the space or time constraint is not continuous, has this kink, we want to have a denser grid for precision, and where the function is smooth, it should be made coarse for speed. And by having the ability to use our own user-defined grid, we can really harness on this ability to do it that way in AndySolve. Okay, so another point I want to make is that we're really having a backwards parabolic problem, and these are not generally solvable. So one can get oscillations and other undesired artifacts in the output near the strike if the grid is uniform. So that means constant spacing everywhere. This lowers the precision and in some cases can even cause a complete blow-up. We have to keep in mind that the Black-Scholes PDE, also others, the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck PDE and the heat equation, they are backwards in time, and backwards problems are generally not solvable. In our case, the PDE problems are sufficiently benign, but for extreme parameter inputs, any backwards parabolic solver will blow up, even on our Black-Scholes and ODE PDEs. Right? The heat equation is equivalent to the Black-Scholes PDE. A general backwards problem is not solvable. In many cases it is, and the theory is very, very complex in trying to determine which backwards problems are solvable and which backwards problems are not solvable. There are no easy solutions. It is an entire field of theory on its own. I just want to mention here at this point, in general, you cannot expect to solve a backwards problem, but in our case, everything is sufficiently benign, where we have to make sure we're gonna get smooth around the strike, and that means we have to make the grid dense at that point. Okay, the next point in this discussion is about flexibility. The penalty method is amenable to all problems that can be priced with the Black-Scholes PDE. But likewise, it can also be used for pricing with the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck model, for example, to price Eurodollar futures, where the returns are not log-normally distributed, but normally distributed. And in that case, it's just necessary to replace the Black-Scholes PDE with the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck PDE, and for futures, it is necessary to replace carry with a zero, because futures don't have any carry. So if you wanted to use this, for example, for net gas or crude, they exhibit volatility spike up as time to expiration approaches. So here the volatility is clearly time dependent and the volatilities go up with decreasing time to expiration. We have to be able to model this somehow. We need definitely time dependent volatilities. The euro dollars usually show the opposite. This is called volatility roll down. So the volatilities go down towards zero as expiration approaches. Right? Again, natural gas volatilities spike up towards expiration. Euro dollars volatility rolls down as we are approaching expiration. And stocks are wildly different. Some stocks increase their volatilities, some decrease, some show no behavior. It is a different story because every stock has its own nature and characteristics. So there's no general statement possible about stocks because the stocks are so different, the companies are so different. But with this method, it's not possible to model volatility spike up or volatility roll down with appropriately chosen functions. For example, you can obtain them with a curve fitting or a regression and use interpolations from historic data. I want to point out that in fact crude and nat gas also show a lot of seasonal behavior in the volatilities, but their month-specific volatility is usually the same. What that means is that the volatility behavior, for example, of all January expirations of the past n years is always quite similar, but the January volatility behavior is very different from, for example, the September expiration volatility. Right? So here we actually have even volatility in it that has to do with the way natural gas is harvested. Natural gas is harvested differently throughout the year. It's not that the natural gas harvest is constant throughout the year. You have some months where you're harvesting a lot and you're harvesting more than you're consuming, so you're pumping it into storage. And then there are other months where you're not harvesting, so now you're depleting your consumption from the storage. But that means you have a lot of time-dependent and seasonal factors, time-dependent and seasonality-based factors in your volatility pricing, in your volatility function. So, and with this pricing method that I'm showing here, it makes the modeling very precise. We can even include seasonality in our pricing. Okay, so with that, I want to come to the implementation. I first want to mention that we want to have a function that creates a rectangular grid for us. This is a helper function that we need to create in order to have this user-defined grid that is dense at the strike and very coarse out in the wings. And we then supply that grid to NDSolve. And as we've seen before, both calls and puts have a kink at the strike. That is a discontinuity in the first derivative, that is in delta. That means at that specific point and only at that point, we don't have a smooth curve, right? We also say the first derivative is not continuous. There we have a jump there. And the first derivative by stock price is delta. At the very moment of expiration, we even have a jump discontinuity there. We have on one side, we have a delta of 0 everywhere on the one side, and we have a delta of 1 everywhere on the other side. Constants, right? Two constants. It's 0 on one side and a constant 1 on the other side. So for smoother integration and also to prevent numeric problems, we create that grid that we want to use with a helper function. So first we need to define our Black-Scholes PDE and our Black-Scholes PDE penalty version. Right? You can see they are the same, except here we are adding epsilon L divided by, well, this denominator that we've discussed previously. They are the same except for this term. So we have these two differential equations. Then we define our make grid functions. Here it creates a grid that is dense at the strike and coarse in the wings. We use a degree parameter that would allow us to specify how dense we want the grid to be at the strike. So let's look at make grid a little bit closer. With strike we specify the strike. With bound we specify the upper and lower bounds of consideration here. And the increment is the increment that we'll use in the table iteration for the grid method. and degree deg is the degree for this. So let's look at our grid builder. We use a strike of 77. We use bounds of plus minus 10 and an increment of a tenth and a second degree. So let's create this and let's look at our grid, and we can see that we are parallel at 77. That was our strike price, right? We can see that the blue curve and the red curve are pretty close there at the strike of 77. This would make for a dense grid there that we have. We could make it much denser by using a higher degree, for example with 4. So I'm changing this parameter here to a 4, and we can see that we have an even larger, well, like subinterval, we have a larger space here where the blue curve is pretty close to the red curve compared to this section above here where the degree was 2. Right? With 2 we're getting this shape, and we can see that the closeness of the red curve and the blue curve is much closer at a larger space around the strike 77 when we use a 4th degree. So let's take this further. Let's make it all the way up to 10 and do a comparison plot. We can see that the lila curve here, degree 10, the curve is pretty close to the red curve, the lila curve pretty close to the red curve for a large area here, for a large section here. And we want to have, perhaps we can see it better when we use the differences. So we can see that the lila curve here is pretty close to the ground, pretty low there. Whereas with the 2nd degree, that's the blue curve, we are touching at the bottom really just around the number 100 here. All right, so we can definitely use degree in a way to define how dense we want our grid to be around the strike. We'll be happy with degree 2, but if we have a really discontinuous problem, we can make it very dense and use a very high degree in this grid maker. Okay, so next I want to point out that in many cases that range is not enough. I've just gone to an upside of 10 with a step length of 1/10 here, plus minus 10 in steps of a tenth. That may not be enough on the upside, so it should be enough on the downside, right? Because stocks can never go negative. In theory, they can go up to infinity. So it may not be enough on the upside, and we want to join with equidistant gridding for the rest of the grid points. We need to look at our maximum value upper S. In my personal opinion, I think 3K is usually enough. That's 3 times the strike. You can't really go much higher in real life. In theory, you can go to 5K or 10K or 100K, but then that adds a lot of uninteresting data point to it, and the increase in precision of any source will not be all that much after a while. So I think 3K is a good sweet spot for this computation. In most cases, there won't be strikes larger than 3 times the spot value. And if you really have a day where the stock price moves up a lot, then the exchange will add new strikes, higher strikes the next day. The exchanges will usually provide plenty of strikes on the upside. And when you have a large up move, then you get new strikes the very next day. So I think 3K is a good practical upper limit, a good trade-off between precision and efficiency. So let's define our upper S as 3K. Let's create our grid with make grid, but I want to join it with more points on the upside. Right? We need to cover the entire segment all the way up to 3K. Right? That is 3 times 77, 231. So we need to have that many points, and we see that we go up to 231 here. The maximum value is 231. So I'm adding more strikes, and here I can use equidistant because we're in the wing, right? We are far out of the money for the puts, deep in the money for the calls. So I'm adding these points equidistant at the upper limit. It's important that we are really dense at the strike. the 77, and on the upside we really don't care about denseness anymore. We want to have a coarse grid there. So next we set our penalty function parameters. We set epsilon to be 1/1,000,000,000 and L to be 10 million. So now we are ready to define our PDEs. So the American put is this definition. We take our BSPDE penalty version. You remember we had two versions of the Black-Scholes PDE. In the American case we use the one with penalty term. At our upper point in T we have the maximum of 0 in k minus s, and keep in mind that we have a backwards problem, so this is really at time 0, and that's where we have parity, and parity was the maximum of 0 in k minus s for the put, and this is our put definition here, so it's max of 0 in k minus s. So now this is the temporal restriction. We need two restrictions in space. For t and lower s it is k, and note that here we need to take parity k minus s. In the European case, you remember it was the discounted strike. So for the European definition here I have to use the discounted strike, but in the American case I have to use parity. But k minus s for a stock price of 0 is simply k, right? So at a stock price of 0 we have a lower value of k, and by assumption, by definition, our upper s, we have a value of 0, and we've said our upper s is 3 times k. We want a really large number here where we can safely set it to 0. Ideally upper s is as high as we want. The sky is the limit, but then we're computing too much and our method is getting too slow. Okay, and we specify our custom grid that we have created with makeGrid in order to use the method of lines with a special discretization that uses our grid method. So this is the American put. For the European put, this is quite similar, except we use the discounted strike. I've explained this in detail in a previous session why it is the discounted strike. I'll just repeat it here. Everything else is the same. Max of k, 0 and k minus s for the temporary restriction. For upper s we say 0 in this special condition. For the American call we use the Black-Scholes penalty version of the PDE, and we have parity of max of 0 s minus k. Here it's the other way around. And for the European call we take the Black-Scholes PDE, no penalty term, and same thing. Okay, so these are our 4 PDEs. So note the important difference that for the American put option, the option price for stock price of 0 is k, whereas in the case of the European put, it is the discounted strike that we have used before. So next we need to define our lowest values for the stock price and the upper and lower values for time to expiration. So we want to compute a 1-year option. Okay, this is where we define the time to expiration. So let's just say we have a 1-year option. So our upper t is 1. Keep in mind it's going to be lower t because on a backwards parabolic problem we're going backwards in time. So for now, set our volatility to a constant 34%, interest rate at 5%, and dividend rate to 0. We're going to make this variable and higher dimensional in a moment. We turn off some annoying warnings from AndySolve and we're ready to go. And you can see that in just 173 milliseconds we computed the American puts, and 127 milliseconds the European put. So now let's plot them. You see that here I use the European put and the American put. We can see these surfaces that are familiar to us. We've seen them before. For the European version, the American version is similar. It is slightly different. So to see the real difference, let's do a difference plot where I'm subtracting them. Here we have the American put minus the European put. Okay, so we see that the difference is not 0. We're getting a surface of differences. So our penalty method really seems to have worked. We have computed our values with the penalty version for the American put PDE. Okay, next we want to make volatility a function of time and space, as we've discussed before, and we want to make the interest rate time dependent. And I'll just set up 3% for the 3.5% instant rate plus another 1% over the next 1 year period. I'll just define it here and I plot it. So we have a volatility smile here. Our surface is a smile for this volatility function that would come from a curve fitting or a regression. This equation here you would have to do with some kind of regression. We have the interest rate function here. I just do a simple linear function here. We start at 3.5% and go up to 4.5% over a 1 year period. So now it takes less than 1 second to compute all these 4 option price surfaces, right? Again, these are surfaces, not just for options. These are 4 option price surfaces. Each option price surface has infinitely many option prices that we can pull from that. So here, if you add these 4 times together, less than a second to compute all this. Okay, and let's plot them. Here we have them as these solutions computed with 2-dimensional volatility and 1-dimensional interest rates. So they look very close. Let's do a difference plot. And again, we see we actually made a difference. This is now the difference plot for our put comparison. And here we have a core comparison. In the core comparison, the difference is basically just numeric error because American and European call have the same price absent of any differences. And this one I would just call numerical error or dirt, right? We're really just getting dirt here. These are very small numbers, less than, what is it? Less than 1/10 of a cent. So this would just be numerical error. Okay, so important things to realize. The American prices can never go below parity. I mentioned that at the very beginning, and here we can verify that. So the blue curve is parity K minus S. And the American curve is orange, and we see that it never goes below the blue curve. It's on the blue curve to the left of the critical stock price point, and it is above the blue curve to the right of it. Whereas the European put price does undercut the blue curve. We see that green is below, blue equals orange to the left of it, and it is below orange to the right of it. Right? You can always see orange is always the highest curve, blue is always below orange, and green can be above or below blue, but never above orange. Okay, so if we plot this here and specifically make it a comparison against parity, right? Here in the first one, we subtract K minus S as a difference. Then we have the American put minus parity is never negative, but the European put minus parity can be negative. And American put minus European put is negative, right? That's equivalent to saying the American put is always at least the European put, as I said in the very beginning. Okay, so here we can verify that these pricing methods work correctly. And we have a smooth joining of parity. I said at the beginning that that's a requirement that we will want to have, and we get that with our ND-solve grid method. We get a very smooth joining of the orange and the blue curve. Okay, it does this in a very smooth manner called smooth pasting condition, value matching condition, or tangency condition. Okay, so it seems we are pretty good at this point. So next, for the portfolio manager, we need more than just the option prices. We also need the Greeks. So let's compute some Greeks with the same method that we have used before. In my second session, we'll use symmetric centered first differences to compute first derivatives. Right? That would be delta and theta. This is pretty much the secant rule. And I use 1/1000 as a step size. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just a convenient number. So if we use 1/1000 as a step size h here, let's do some plots. Let's define again our sigma, r, and delta. Let's compute it. It took 140 milliseconds for this entire option surface. Let's define h, and let's do a delta plot, right? We have this function here where we use s plus h minus the option price s minus h divided by 2h, right? This is our secant rule. So we get this delta function. It looks very similar to the delta that we've seen in previous sessions. For the European version, it's not drastically different, but it's now an American delta. So this is what our American delta looks like. Let's do the same for theta, and here we're doing this subtraction and division for t. It's 1 minus t. Well, it has to be 1 minus t because we're going backwards in time. It's a backwards parabolic problem. We have minus h, we have plus h, and we divide by 2h, and here we see our theta. You will see the spike as time goes down to 0, which is again the same you will recognize from the European version in previous session, right? We have an absolute spike in theta as we near the strike and time to expiration goes down to 0. Very same spike behavior that we have here. And as before, we'll use the second order centered differences for the second derivative, that is gamma. So the formula for that is this formula here. It is f of x plus h minus 2 times f of x plus f of x minus h divided by h squared. So here I want to point out the point I made earlier, that we need 3 times f computations if we want to do this with a tree. Here we would now have to compute 3 option prices, submit 3 trees just to compute 1 gamma, right? Whereas here we can do everything vectorially. So now let's plot it here. This is our gamma, again similar to the European case. We have a gamma spike up around the strike as time goes down to 0. We'll use the same method to compute vega. Now vega is a parameter, not a variable, so we have to add h and minus, and we have to add h and subtract h in our function for volatility directly, and then do the division by 2h. We do that here. So we compute one surface for plus h and we compute one surface for minus h. Now we can use these two surfaces, that is put American option plus and put American option minus. That's why I called them PAMP and PAM minus. And when we plot this, we're now getting the vega surface. You will recognize this looks again similar to the European case from previous sessions. This is what our vega looks like. Pretty smooth, I would say, and this is a typical vega shape that we have. Again, done with the simple secant rule. We can also do this for time and price dependent volatility again, right? One of the beauties that I've pointed out, we can use time and price dependent volatility, and we can use time dependent interest rate. So if we do that here, then we are computing our American put, and then here let's do our secant rule. You see that here we are plus h on one, minus h on the one that we subtract here, divide by 2h, and here we see really a difference between them. I want to point out this is not an error plot, right? This is a legitimate delta for two-dimensional volatilities and one-dimensional interest rate, not an error plot. These differences may look small. We're going from minus 0.02 to plus minus 0.02, but these are delta differences due to the fact that we have non-constant volatilities and rates. It's not an error plot. This is a legitimate delta for such a volatility. Okay, we can do the same thing with time, and here we're getting a similar theta function that we had before. Probably not much of a difference that we can see, but here we do this with gamma. we're also getting now a gamma that looks similar to what we had before. We have s plus h minus 2 times f of s plus the expression for s plus h divided by h squared. That was our gamma formula, and here we have our gamma spike. Okay, so in the next one, let's do it for the two-dimensional volatility for Vega, and then let's compare this as a difference. Here we just have to do it as a difference plot, otherwise we couldn't see much. And I want to point out that again, this is not an error plot. This is simply due to two-dimensional volatility and one-dimensional interest rates. So this may not look like much, but for the algorithmic market maker, these are very important differences in the Greeks. Right? If you were to do this with constant volatility and constant interest rate, you would get bad prices, you would get bad option prices, and that feeds through to bad Vegas. Okay, so here we're showing Vegas with two-dimensional volatility, one-dimensional rate. Okay, this is a much better Vega surface that you get with this grid method. You can't use constant numbers for volatility or rates. You need a grid method that allows you to model these dependencies. Okay, I want to mention that for the standard Greeks, we can get this a little bit easier. The Greeks and partial derivatives for the integration variables time and space can also be obtained directly from NDSolve. With the centered symmetric differences, we got very good results above, but we needed to manage it on our own. We had to implement the secant rule and the higher order method for gamma, and we can take partial derivatives from the interpolation function objects directly that we get returned from NDSolve. So as the differences are so small, I go straight to the different plots. So let's look at delta. We can take our computed solution that we have, right? We have already computed this, and we can use derivative 0, 1 directly on it. So that means no derivative in the time dimension and the first derivative in the space dimension. And I call it delta. And if I now take the difference between that delta and my own delta, you remember I called it my own delta. Above I had intercepted that variables because I knew I was going to use it here. Then we get basically white noise, right? Dirt. I call these things sometimes dirt. We go from 10 to the minus 8 to plus 10 to the minus 8. So this is basically just dirt. So there is no difference. We have a bit of a difference here. I believe this is due to the fact that I use centered symmetric differences, but that's only valid for interior point, and at the border you can't really use interior points. And I think that NDSolve and the derivative here do this a bit smarter. The centered differences you can really use only for interior point. But we are going here at a time of 1/1000, right? So that's a very short time to expiration. And now let's go to gamma. This would now be the second derivative by space. So we say derivative of 0, 2. No derivative in time, and the second in space, I call it gamma. And let's do a difference plot. This is now again an error plot. These two plots here are error plots. And again, this is basically dirt. And let's do the same with theta. Here we have to take the first derivative in time and no derivative in space. That's theta, and let's plot the differences here. And again, I would say they're pretty much 0. We have a bit of a spike here for numeric error, but look at this flat surface. This is 0, right? This is 0. Let's do a plot range from minus 1 to 1. What will we get? This should basically, yeah, see, except for just a few instants before expiration, we still get a difference of 0. Very smooth here. How about 1/100, 1/100? So we are getting 0, right? We are getting 0 for our practical purposes, except numerical error just before expiration. So I want to give a footnote. The reason the plots above took so long is because of the graphical rendering. The timing numbers above should convince you that the computations themselves aren't slow at all. It was really time spent mostly on the graphical rendering. And again, I give you a reminder that these computations on the order of 100 to 200 milliseconds is for an entire option surface. That means containing all the expirations and all the stock prices, right? Not just for one single method as we would get with a tree method. All right. So next I want to show you a very practical third order grid method to compute American puts. We have financial derivative in Mathematica, but I generally prefer to use a third order grid method that computes the American put prices, not just point-wise, one computation per requested stock price, but for the whole stock price interval, right? I've already mentioned it a few times. I'm sure by now you can believe me. I don't want to submit a computation for just one value. I want to get an entire one-dimensional interval, maybe two-dimensional interval. So we definitely want to improve over the simple financial derivative function in Mathematica. So it's the stock price or futures price. In general, it's the underlying that ticks the fastest in the live markets. So we want to have all these put prices already pre-computed in memory at the time when we need them and not trigger the computation when we need them. We just want to read them off from memory when the prices are already in an interpolation object. And Mathematica uses third order interpolation by default. That is equivalent, almost entirely equivalent to a cubic spline, right? So we don't want to launch the computation the moment we need it. We want to read it off from memory, and interpolation already gives us third order. For all practical purposes, it's a cubic spline that we get. So in the following, I present a very efficient American put price function based on a third order grid. It is 100% explicit. So as usual case, the strike, R is the interest rate, sigma is the volatility, tau is the time to expiration, and n is a natural number that determines the special grid size. So this is similar to a step parameter in a tree-based model. So we have some control over the precision here by adjusting our parameter n. So higher values of n give us a finer grid method in the spatial dimension. So for theoretical reasons that I cannot cover in a short video like this, alpha in our code, and I'll have this here. Alpha is s over s divided by h squared. S over h squared is alpha. We have a parameter t0 over m. So this is our time interval divided by m temporal steps, and we call that s. And we have a variable h, which is 2a over n. If we set all of them up and then solve for m, we're getting this expression for m. We can further simplify this method. We can use an m, that's the temporal step size, that depends on our spatial step size, and the variable, the inputs, sigma squared and tau, and a parameter a that we have. Those are used to adjust our parameters. Those are used to adjust our option pricing precision. So this is one way to compute one parameter, the temporal step size parameter, directly as a function of the other inputs. I want to have this done automatically because the original method was using n and m independently, n for the spatial step size, m for the temporal step size. And I don't want them to be independently because then I do not have a guarantee that my alpha will not exceed a half, but that would be needed for a 100% explicit method, otherwise it becomes unstable. And I do want it to be as close as possible to a half for speed reasons. If I don't make it a half but leave it lower, then I give up speed. And if I go above a half, then I get lack of stability. So this is the way to compute m automatically. We will now always have alpha just a smidgen below a half. Okay, and here we have our method. I will not go into it in detail, but we will compile it for speed, and we see that m is this function that we have just solved, this expression that we have developed above with this solve, where we set alpha equal to a half. This would be alpha equal to a half, and by rounding it up we ensure that our alpha will be less than a half and not above a half. So we compile this expression, and I want to make sure we understand that it really compiles completely into machine code. And we can do that with the compile function tools, and then with compile print on our compiled put expression, we can now check if we have really good machine code. So we have 5 arguments, we have 16 integer registers, 16 real registers, and 12 tensor registers. And when we have registers, that's always good news. That's the fastest way to store these things in memory and have machine code operate on them, right? We don't have any remaining calls into the Mathematica evaluator. And we can see that by checking through the whole thing, we never see main evaluator. If we needed to go from the machine code back into the Mathematica kernel, we would have a call here that uses main evaluator. But we don't have this. We have everything here, these operations on these registers, right? If not, it would make a call to main evaluate, which we don't have. So we have really nice machine code here. It fully compiled completely into these instructions for machine code. So we see that put C compiled to C completely without any remaining calls to the Mathematica kernel. So with that, we now get a list of node points, and they consist of the stock price and the American option price. I should call it put price. And it has the length of n+1. And with that, we can now make our computations. Let's just check on these vectors that we get back. It's a 2-dimensional vector. Here we have node point and option price, node point, option price. And we start fairly low, right? This is a stock price of 0.5182, and we go all the way up to $11,427. That's a rather high stock price, and there, of course, the price has to be 0. It's a put, and you remember that for upper S, our put price was also set to 0 when we configured our American PDE and also the European PDE. Okay, so this looks good. We now create an interpolation on these 2-dimensional vectors. Let's just pick 55 as a random stock price. It's not a node point, but we can request it due to the interpolation. And with 1,000 steps, I think it was fairly fast. Let's compute it again. See, with 1,000 steps, it's there instantly. Let's time it. With 1,000 steps, it's 59 milliseconds. With 3,000 steps, it's 1.4 seconds. So I won't be using the 3,000 steps all the time, just when I want to make verifications, but the 1,000 steps look reasonable. It's instantly there. With 3,000 steps, it's a little bit more precise, but it is, what is this? 6% of a cent, right? It's 6 divided over 10,000, so it's a really small error that we get there. So the Mathematica function financial derivative agrees with that price. We get 23.12. When I use the standard binomial method, again, you will see it gave me just one price. The return of this is an atomic number. So we have no vector here, no list, nothing. It's just the atomic price. For precision, let's use the grid size option and make it 10,000 steps in time and space. It's a ridiculously large number, and that's why it takes ridiculously long, but we can use it for verification of the precision, and we get the same price, right? 23.1218. That's exactly what we had here in 3,000 steps, which only took 1.4 seconds, right? For 3,000 steps, it was 1.4 seconds. So we get a verification here. Mathematica's function agrees with that. We get the very same prices, 12, and 1218. Okay, so the computed result of the binomial tree in Mathematica's function financial derivative is only valid for the spot price 55, whereas put C is usable for all spot prices once it's in an interpolation object. I won't get tired of mentioning it. And you see that in no time we've computed and plotted with our function put C, and have done this for several strikes here from 60 to 90 in steps of 5, and we have done it for 10 expirations from 1/10 of a year up to 1 year in steps of 1/10 of a year. Okay, was fairly fast. We get round smooth curves here. There's no ragged edges. We get really good performance from the method, and we get also good plotting performance here. Note that I've set the interpolation order to 3. We want to interpolate these call and put prices with a third order method, and I think really it was pretty fast. We plot again something. Note the time. The computation may take a tad longer with 1,000 or 3,000 steps, but we get infinitely many stock prices that we can now read off from memory. Right? All this was read off directly from memory. We get smooth results even though this is an explicit method and not an implicit method. That's also important to notice, right? From implicit methods we can expect smoothness, but they take longer to compute. With explicit methods they're very fast, but we don't always get smooth results, right? Explicit methods can be very ragged, very unsmooth or non-smooth. So our results here are pretty smooth even for an explicit method. So here we use low numbers for volatility. 10% is pretty low, and time to maturity I'm setting it to 1 day while using only 1,000 steps. And look how fast it is, and we get the results plotted instantly for these vectors, right? We go in time from 1/10 of a year to, no, I'm sorry, this is volatility, from 10% volatility to 120% volatility in steps of 10%, and from 1 day to 1 month in steps of 1 day, right? So this is 30 plots here. We accomplished 30 plots in that amount of time, and we accomplished, what is that, 12 volatility curves here, right? Pretty fast, pretty precise, everything is smooth. Okay, but next we can speed things up even more if we use parallelism, right? Let's not forget that with Mathematica we get parallelism. Let's launch 12 subkernels. The reason I like to use 12 is because I want to have one subkernel for each physical core that I have. This computer has 12 physical cores, so I usually launch the kernels with $processor count. I won't use hyperthreading here, otherwise I could launch it with 24, but I want to keep it with just 12. Whenever you do hardcore math, it's a good idea to not use too much hyperthreading, but keep it with a number of physical cores. So let's compute weekly options for the next half year. We now have every Friday is an option expirations. They're called the weeklies because they expire every week, every Friday. So with our time variable, we go from 0 to half a year in steps of 1 week. Okay, and I submit them with parallel puts and see how fast this was, 110 milliseconds. And if I do it sequentially, this is the same computation, but I do it sequentially now, then let's look at the speed up factor. It is 3. So we were 3 times faster by doing it in parallel. I think that's quite an achievement. With this method, you could compute different option expirations in parallel. You probably have multiple expirations in your portfolio. Typically, you're not just interested in one expiration or one option price. You usually have to compute for all the expirations, and then why not take the weeklies, right? You compute the weeklies here with this parallel method. You typically have weekly options in your portfolio when you do stock options. Okay, so with the speed up factor of 3, let's check if they are the same. The prices are identical. That's a good verification to do. Otherwise you do something wrong with your setup. And let's plot the weeklies. Here they are. So we have from 1 week to half a year in steps of 1 week. No, from zero to half a year in steps of 1 week. Here are your weekly options. So let's also use parallelism on the volatilities. So here we go from 10% to 150% in steps of 10%. We submit that in parallel. Note the timing. It comes back in 1 second. And let's do it sequentially in comparison. That will take much longer. Our speed up factor here is also 3.97. Oh, here it was 3 and here it is 4. I'm sorry. Here the speed up factor is around 4. Check if they're identical. That's the case. And plot them for different volatilities of the weeklies. All right, here we have them. Okay, so I think it's a fairly good method. We can, of course, model the parameters depending on other factors. For example, let's look at volatility skew again. We had mentioned it before. Here, every strike has a different volatility. For puts, it's typical to have a convex function that is larger for lower strikes and smaller for larger strikes. For example, something like this. Let's define this function and plot it. So this would be a typical volatility skew. So a 60 strike has a volatility of, 0.458, 456, whatever that is. And the lower strike, the upper strike for 90, we have 0.38. This would be a typical volatility skew, and such a function sigma would come from a regression or curve fitting that you have computed from real-life market data. You back out the imp volts, right? That is called backing out the imp volts. And when you back out the imp volts, you do a regression, and that would be a function similar to this. And real-life data would typically show you this type of volatility skew for the puts. Okay, so here the differences are pretty small compared to constant computation, right? So here for comparison, I use a constant 40%, and in the other case, I use our volatility function sigma of tau. And if we plot these differences, then we clearly get different behavior in these prices. Again, this is not an error plot, it's a difference plot. Here I take the difference between these two computations, but it's a difference plot in order to show the differences that are made by using strike-dependent volatilities, aka skew. It's not a difference plot to show a small error. These are intended differences. Okay, so this brings me towards the end of my session today. I want to make some comments on the performance of this method. The original method had m as an independent input. I had already mentioned that. That means m was not computed through a formula that depends on a, n, sigma, and tau to produce alpha just barely below a half. But as we solve alpha for m, we see that m is directly proportional to tau, the time to expiration. That means the method is particularly suitable for short-term options. As they compute faster, you could afford to increase n and thereby m for smaller tau. Right? M and n are going in the same direction. Here's a reminder, this was the formula for m. M is depending on n squared, so as you increase n, you increase m. And vice versa, but we're not going that way. We increase m by an increase of n, not the other way around. Right? So you could afford to increase n and thereby m for smaller tau, because they're both in the numerator of these fractions. As a direct consequence, that means longer term options also take longer to compute. Okay, that's the unfortunate side of it, but typically we need more precision on the short-term options than the long-term options. And typically we have more short-term options in the portfolio than long-term options. And the same is true for higher volatility sigma. Look at the formula for m. It's also proportional with sigma squared. Right? So m is proportional to the square n, the square sigma, and tau. So the same reasoning is true for the volatility sigma. You can see that m is directly proportional to the product of sigma squared t. Therefore, for lower volatility, you can also afford to use more steps if you want to. Okay? And you can also use the speedups from parallelism to use more steps, for example, 3000 or 5000. So this will definitely take longer, but you get more precision. And if you follow my advice to pre-compute everything and not introduce latency into your trading by computing things on the fly, that means no sooner than when they are needed, which means you're always lagging behind, then there's plenty of time before trading starts to pre-compute whatever you need. Well, just start your pre-computing half an hour earlier. You know when the option market open, it's 9:30 Eastern time. So start your computation at 9 o'clock Eastern time, right, or earlier. If you have a lot or your computation takes forever, start computing at 8 o'clock, right? Pre-compute everything so that you are ready when you need it. You can do this by launching batch computations half an hour before trading starts and keep everything in memory. Just don't crash the computer, please. Or you can use memorization to remember values that have been computed before, so you never compute the same thing twice. That would also be a waste of time. Why compute something you already have computed? The moment you have computed it, store it in memory. That's called memorization. Never compute it again, because next time you need it, it will be read from memory and not recomputed. So another note, I want to make a note on compilation. The rules for C and machine code compilation are quite a bit different from how we program in a high-level language such as Mathematica. In fact, some things may really seem unintuitive. For example, if we replace the table of 0 for n plus 1 elements in our putC function, let's look at this again. Here we have a table of zeros, n plus 1 times here. If we replace this with a constant array, we replace this with the constant array 0 of n plus 1, which is how we would use this typically in Mathematica code, then we suddenly could no longer compile the function into nothing but machine code instructions. So if you replace this table with this constant array and do a compile print, then you will see that you now have a new expression main evaluate in it, which means there is a callback into the Mathematica kernel, and that will slow down the computation. In pure Mathematica code, we would prefer constant array over table, but the rules for compilation are different. There are different rules. Keep in mind that it may sometimes seem unintuitive, and even though we would prefer constant array in Mathematica code, we will want to have table when we compile it into C. Okay, that brings me at the end of my talk. Here are resources for the penalty method that I have presented. I hope you had as much fun as I had, and I hope I see you in my next session. Thank you. Bye-bye.